Okay, this talk is a sympathetic critique of Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities. The wider context of the talk is the project of reconstructing classical economics, specifically its theory of distribution and value. And here we'll look at two reductions in Sraffa's work: his reduction of natural prices to dated quantities of labour, and his reduction of the standard commodity to the variable quantity of labour it commands in the market. I'll show that both these reductions are incomplete in the sense they fail to fully reduce to real costs of production measured in labour time. And in contrast, I'll present the complete reductions and then discuss the implications of these complete reductions for the post-Sraffian reconstruction of the classical theory of value and distribution. Okay, let's start then with Sraffa's reduction of natural prices. Sraffa considers a system that produces a surplus that gets distributed to workers and capitalists. He defines a natural price equation with wages paid ex ante and a uniform profit rate. Here's the equation: P are prices, A is the input-output matrix, R is the profit rate, L are the direct labour coefficients, and W is the wage rate. Sraffa assumes a fixed scale and composition of output and restricts his analysis to conjectural variations in the distribution of nominal income, that is, the wage rate and the profit rate. Okay, so Sraffa rewrites his price equation in an equivalent series form, and he provides a dated economic interpretation of this series. He says it's a sum of a series of terms when we trace back the successive stages of the production of the commodity. Let's look at the nth term in that series, which corresponds to production interpreted to occur n years in the past. It consists of the vector of wage bills advanced to each sector, plus the interest on each advance compounded over n years. In other words, Sraffa reduces natural prices to labour costs multiplied by a profit factor at a compound rate for the appropriate period. Now, Sraffa draws some immediate conclusions from his reduction equation. When profits are zero and wages are maximum, the compound profit factors disappear from the series expansion, and natural prices turn out to be proportional to classical labour values. But Sraffa notes that at no other wage level do values, he means prices, follow a simple rule. That's because in general the profit rate is positive and natural prices are not proportional to classical labour values. And therefore there is no simple rule that relates labour costs and natural prices. Now, there's different ways to state the consequences of this lack of a simple rule, but Sraffa says it this way. He says the reduction to dated labour seems conclusive in showing the impossibility of aggregating the periods belonging to the several quantities of labour into a single magnitude which could be regarded as representing the quantity of capital. He goes on to say, reversals in the direction of the movement of relative prices in the face of unchanged methods of production cannot be reconciled with any notion of capital as a measurable quantity independent of distribution and prices. In other words, I can't reduce a quantity of capital, such as the cost price of a collection of means of production, to a single scalar measure that is independent of prices and income distribution. Now, there are various consequences of this lack of a simple rule, but for the classical labour theory of value we can state the consequences quite simply. Labour values are independent of income distribution, but prices vary with income distribution. And therefore a price can always vary for a reason entirely unconnected with labour costs, and in consequence prices are not reducible to labour costs. So that's Sraffa's reduction equation and his surrounding arguments summarised. I'm now going to show that Sraffa's reduction is incomplete because it does not resolve prices entirely into wages. Now, Sraffa restricted his analysis to conjectural variations in nominal income. Here we'll consider the complement of this variation, specifically conjectural variations in real income. So let's consider that the net product of the system is distributed in the form of the real wage W and capitalist consumption C. We therefore have this quantity equation that describes the economy. Q are quantities, W is a real wage, C is a capitalist consumption bundle. Now, in a self-reproducing state, the distribution of nominal income, specified by the profit and wage rate, is sufficient to purchase the real income, specified by bundles W and C. In fact, the price and quantity equations together imply this equation. The left-hand side is the sum of wage and profit income, and the right-hand side is the expenditure in commodity markets by workers and capitalists. Let's assume further that workers and capitalists spend what they earn. In consequence, the wage income equals the cost of the real wage, and profit income equals the cost of capitalist consumption. Now, once we consider the distribution of income, both in nominal and real terms, some important conclusions follow. So I'll step through this just so that it's very clear and transparent. From the previous slide, the profit rate is the ratio of capitalist income to investment, and we can substitute this expression into the natural price equation. Then we can expand out the term in brackets by multiplying by PA. Then we can factor out prices P, and notice this term C transpose PA is a matrix. Let's call that matrix C. So we can rewrite natural prices as PA plus PC plus LW. And it features the matrix C, which is an n by n matrix where each element is given by this expression below at the bottom of the slide, which is a ratio of two price terms multiplied by a real consumption coefficient. So what is this matrix C? Well, this expression here is the profit income generated by the sale of 1 unit of commodity J. This expression here is the quantity of commodity I distributed to capitalists per unit of profit income. In consequence, Cij is the quantity of commodity I distributed to capitalists per unit output of commodity J. In other words, matrix C is a capitalist consumption matrix that specifies how the production of output is synchronized with the distribution of goods from sectors to capitalist households. And note that matrix C is a physical input-output matrix that specifies relative material flows of commodities, and each element of C has the exact same units as the corresponding element of the technology matrix A. So let's recap. We started with natural prices, then given a distribution of real income, we derive an equivalent price expression that features a capitalist consumption matrix. Natural prices in this representation comprise the cost of means of production, PA, the cost of maintaining the capitalist class at its given level of consumption, PC, and the cost of labour, LW. We therefore have an alternative but equivalent dated quantities of labour representation, which reduces prices to a sum of labour costs, including the labour costs of producing capitalist consumption goods. The point is that the profit rate has gone and it's been replaced by a real variable, the capitalist consumption matrix. And in consequence, natural prices are completely reducible to a sum of labour costs. In fact, we've proved a theorem. Let's define total labour values in contrast to classical labour values as tilde V equals tilde V tilde A plus L, where tilde A is the technique augmented by capitalist consumption. Total labour values measure the direct, indirect and super indirect labour supplied to produce unit commodities, where super indirect labour refers to the labour supplied to produce capitalist consumption goods. And we prove the following equivalence theorem. Given an economy with natural prices and a real distribution of income and zero saving, then the natural prices equal the total labour values multiplied by the wage rate. That is, natural prices are the wage bill of the direct, indirect and super indirect labour supplied to produce commodities. So once we measure in terms of total labour values, then the labour commanded by a commodity equals the labour embodied in it, and in consequence the structure of natural prices is entirely dual and complementary to the structure of physical real costs measured in labour time. So Sraffa's reduction is incomplete because it ignores the super indirect labour supplied to produce capitalist consumption goods during the successive stages of the production of the commodity. Now, when we ignore the super indirect labour and restrict ourselves to a purely technical measure of the real costs of production, we get classical labour values. And classical labour values are the right measure to answer distribution-independent questions about an economy, such as the technical productivity of labour. On the other hand, when we include super indirect labour as a real cost of production, we get total labour values. And total labour values are the right measure to answer distribution-dependent questions about an economy, such as what real costs do prices represent. My point is that a more general labour theory of value needs to employ both kinds of measures in the appropriate contexts. Now, some of Sraffa's statements therefore need qualification because they're based on an incomplete reduction. Sraffa states that at no other wage level do values follow a simple rule. However, this statement is true when we compare prices with a purely technical measure of labour costs. But when we compare prices to a total measure that includes the super indirect labour supplied, then we can see that prices follow a simple rule at every wage level. Sraffa also states that his results cannot be reconciled with any notion of capital as a measurable quantity independent of distribution and prices. However, we can reduce a quantity of capital to a single scalar measure that is independent of prices. We simply measure the capital with total labour values. That requires observing the technique and the distribution of real income. This measure is independent of prices, but it does depend on the distribution of real income. We can summarize all this by stating that natural prices and physical real costs measured in labour time are linked by a simple rule, but this simple rule is missing from Sraffa's work. Okay, so now I want to turn to the second part of my talk, and here we'll examine Sraffa's construction of the standard commodity, which is really quite an amazing theoretical argument. Sraffa begins his chapter on the standard commodity with this statement. He says, "The necessity of having to express the price of one commodity in terms of another, which is arbitrarily chosen as standard, complicates the study of the price movements which accompany a change in distribution. It is impossible to tell of any particular price fluctuation, whether it arises from the peculiarities of the commodity which is being measured, or from those of the measuring standard." Now, it's important to understand that this necessity to express prices in terms of prices arises only because we lack an external measure of prices, such as real costs measured in labour time. If we had an external standard, we could express the price of one commodity in terms of a standard outside the market, or to use Ricardo's phrase, we could use a standard found in nature. But Sraffa's reduction, as far as he was concerned, demonstrated that labour costs do not and cannot function as an external standard. So, in a way, we are stuck within the price system and must choose an internal standard of measure, which is normally called the numéraire. But Sraffa says that this choice causes a complication. What is that complication? Now, when we solve Sraffa's price equation, either by specifying the wage or profit rate, we get a set of relative, not absolute prices. We get a price ray. We therefore have a degree of freedom that we can fix by specifying a numéraire, which adds the constraint in general PD equals 1 for some commodity bundle D. A simple example would be to choose a single commodity, say corn, to have the price of 1. Now let's consider situations A and B that share the same technology but differ in income distribution. And let's define delta P as the difference in prices from situation A and B, delta R as the difference in the profit rate, and delta W as the difference in the wage rate. Now we can substitute those delta terms into the natural price equation, and with some algebraic manipulation derive this expression here, which defines the change in price of the numéraire. But since we fixed the price of the numéraire to be 1 by convention, then its change equals 0. We substitute that into the previous equation to derive what Bellino calls the numéraire effect. The numéraire effect imposes a constraint on the change in prices from situation A to situation B. This equation is very informative. it tells us that the change in prices due to a change in the distribution of income is not independent of our choice of numéraire. In other words, the complication we face is that the choice of measuring standard affects the system it measures, and this is Sraffa's measurement problem. Sraffa would therefore like to define a standard that doesn't affect the system it measures, so price fluctuations could be, so to speak, observed in a vacuum. And here's the amazing bit. In a nutshell, Sraffa defines a standard commodity, which we'll denote as B, that satisfies this eigenvector equation. If we choose such a B to satisfy that equation, then it has the special property that, regardless of prices P, its cost of production, PAB, is always a constant fraction lambda of its selling price, and no matter how prices change, this relationship always holds. So in a sense, the peculiarities of production of the standard commodity transmit cost price changes to its output price in a specially balanced and invariant manner. Now, when we choose the standard commodity as the numéraire, then the numéraire effect simplifies and becomes this expression. The delta P terms cancel out and disappear, which means that the standard commodity does not impose any constraint on the change in prices from situation A to situation B. So the standard commodity is a measuring standard that does not affect what it measures. And when we choose it as numéraire, it helps us derive some simple relationships. Sraffa says it renders visible what was hidden, and he uses it to derive this famous expression here, which relates the profit rate to the wage rate via big R, which is the maximum possible profit rate given the technique A. R here is a fixed physical magnitude that breaks down into profit and wage income, independent of prices. So in Passanetti's view, for example, this means we can treat the distribution of income independently of prices, and this possibility is not tied to the pure labour theory of value, which has intractable contradictions that are well known in the literature. So Sraffa reconstructs the surplus approach to distribution, and this equation here is one example of that reconstruction. However, Sraffa doesn't stop here. He also attempts to reconstruct the classical idea of measuring the surplus in terms of labour costs, and he does this by proposing another kind of reduction. He describes the standard commodity as a purely auxiliary construction that can be displaced by a more tangible measure, and the more tangible measure is the labour commanded by the standard net product in the marketplace, which is price divided by the wage rate. In other words, Sraffa reduces the standard commodity to a quantity of labour that varies with the distribution of income. And this quantity of labour, because it's derived from the standard commodity, also nullifies the numéraire effect. And Sraffa says, all the properties of an invariable standard of value are found in a variable quantity of labour, which however varies according to a simple rule which is independent of prices. Okay, but Sraffa's reduction of the standard commodity to a variable quantity of labour is also incomplete, in the sense that it remains a labour commanded measure, irreducibly defined in terms of nominal phenomena. And this variable quantity of labour does not denote a real cost of production. So Sraffa is not entirely successful in reconstructing the classical idea of constructing an invariable measure in terms of labour costs. However, we can complete Sraffa's reduction and pinpoint exactly what labour costs his variable quantity of labour denote. It's easy to show that Sraffa's variable quantity of labour is in fact the total labour cost of the standard commodity. So in other words, Sraffa's variable quantity is the direct, indirect and super-indirect labour supplied to produce the standard commodity, and therefore we can replace the standard commodity with a physical real cost of production. So there was quite a lot to take in there, so allow me to recap. According to Sraffa's reduction to data quantities of labour, there is no simple rule relating natural prices and labour costs. In consequence, labour costs cannot function as a price-independent invariable standard of prices, and there's a necessity to express prices in terms of prices. However, Sraffa discovers, via his construction of the standard commodity, that in the specific case of changes in income distribution, a variable quantity of labour is an invariable standard, and its variability follows a simple rule. So he rediscovers a simple rule. And this chain of reasoning is remarkable. However, it is based on an incomplete reduction. And once we begin with the complete reduction, we get a very different picture. We see that there is a simple rule that relates natural prices and labour costs. And in consequence, labour costs can function as a price-independent invariable standard of prices, and therefore there is no necessity to express prices in terms of prices. Total labour costs are immediately an invariable standard of value as defined by Sraffa. And it turns out that Sraffa's variable quantity of labour is in fact the total labour cost of the standard commodity, and therefore can be reduced to a real cost of production. In other words, Sraffa's variable quantity of labour is an indirect or proxy reference to total labour cost, which is the external standard of prices missing from the classical labour theory of value. Okay, so to conclude, the presence of incomplete reductions in Sraffa's production of commodities by means of commodities implies that there cannot be a concept of objective value that reductively explains the structure of natural prices in terms of real costs of production. In consequence, the post-Sraffian reconstruction of classical economics is partial because it dispenses with an essential aim of a theory of economic value, which is to explain what the unit of account might measure or refer to. However, by completely reducing natural prices to objective labour costs, we have the opportunity to reconstruct both the classical theory of distribution and its theory of value. But in order to do this, we need to construct a more general labour theory of value that includes both technical and total measures of labour costs and use those measures in the appropriate contexts.